The cold was a constant companion. It lived in the stone floors of the great keep, seeping through the thin soles of her worn leather slippers. It clung to the damp wool of her servant's dress and settled deep in her bones, a permanent chill that 10 years of silence had done nothing to warm. Ilara knew cold. It was the absence of a mother's hand, the emptiness of a feasting hall after everyone had gone, the hollow space in her throat where words used to live. Her world was a tapestry woven from the senses that remained to her. The scratch of burlap against her cheek as she carried sacks of grain. The sharp, metallic tang of blood as she helped the cooks pluck game birds. The scent of pine and wood smoke that clung to the Alpha King, a scent of power and wilderness that she only ever experienced from a distance. And sound. She was a connoisseur of sounds. The scuff of a guard's boot, the whisper of a courtier's silk, the crackle of the fire in the great hearth. Each told a story she could no longer tell herself. Her own story was a scorched ruin, a memory of fire, of screaming that had torn her throat raw until it had simply given up, sealing her voice inside with the ashes of her family. She had been found wandering the charred forest, a silent, smoke-stained child of 8. They had brought her here, to the keep of the great Alpha King Kalen, the ruler of the northern wastes. A king so old and powerful he was more myth than man. She was given a cot, a servant's tunic, and a name whispered in pity: the Mute Girl. For a decade she had been less than a ghost. Ghosts, at least, were rumored to whisper. Ilara was just a pair of hands, a silent set of feet to fetch and carry. She was useful, and therefore she was permitted to exist. It was a meager existence, but it was hers. She polished silver until she could see her own haunted face reflected in it, a face too pale, with eyes too large and dark. She scrubbed floors until her knuckles were raw, erasing the footprints of people who never knew she was there. Her most treasured duty, the one she fought for, was tending the kennels. The pack's wolves were magnificent creatures, loyal and fierce. They did not care that she couldn't speak. They understood the language of a gentle hand, of a steady presence. They whined softly when she was near and licked her fingers, their warmth a temporary balm against the ever-present cold. It was there, in the straw-scented warmth of the kennels, that she found him. He was the runt of a new litter, pushed aside by his stronger siblings. The kennel master, a gruff man named Borin, had picked him up by the scruff. "This one's no good," he'd grumbled, his voice rough as gravel. Eyes are clouded, born blind. Ilara's heart had seized in her chest. She knew what that meant. Imperfection was not tolerated. Weakness was a stain to be cleansed. The pup would be left on the mountain for the frost or the crows. It was the pack's way. A hard way, for a hard land. She had watched Borin place the tiny, whimpering bundle in a wooden bucket destined for the refuse pile. Her hands trembled. Every instinct screamed at her to remain invisible, to not draw attention. But as she looked at the squirming scrap of black fur, fighting for a life it couldn't even see, she saw herself. Small, broken, and discarded. That night, under the sliver of a crescent moon, she stole the bucket. She smuggled the pup back to her tiny alcove of a room, a space barely large enough for her cot. She wrapped him in a piece of her own worn cloak and fed him drops of goat's milk from a rag. He was so small, his whole body fit in the cup of her 2 hands. His eyes, a milky, sightless blue, stared up at nothing. He made a small, snuffing sound and nudged his nose into her palm, seeking warmth, seeking life. A feeling bloomed in her chest, fierce and hot. It was a feeling she hadn't allowed herself in years. It was possession. It was purpose. Nyx, she thought, the name a silent whisper in her mind. For the darkness he was born into. Nyx became her secret, her sin, her reason. She carried him everywhere, tucked inside a sling she'd fashioned under her cloak. He was a warm, breathing weight against her ribs, a constant reminder of her transgression. During the day, he slept. At night, in the privacy of her room, she let him explore. And he walked into everything: the leg of her cot, the wall, the small wooden stool. Each soft thud of his head against an obstacle was a blow to her own heart. She would scoop him up, stroking his fur, her mind racing. How could he survive if he couldn't navigate the world? She began to teach him. She had no voice to call him, so she used other sounds. A soft click of her tongue, a gentle tap of her finger on the floorboards. She would tap, and he would turn his head, his ears twitching, trying to pinpoint the source. When he moved toward the sound, she would reward him with a touch, a stroke of his favorite spot behind the ears. Slowly, painstakingly, he began to learn. Tap, 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 come here. A soft hum, the only sound she could make, a low vibration in her chest. Stay. You are safe. It was a language of their own, built in silence and shadow. He was her shadow, and she was his guide. His world was darkness, but it was a darkness filled with the map of her sounds, her scent, her touch. He was growing, his legs getting stronger, his black coat sleek and healthy. But her fear grew with him. A secret this large could not be kept forever. The day it unraveled began like any other. Cold floors, gray light, the distant sound of the keep waking up. She was tasked with serving at the morning court, a rare and dreaded duty. It meant being visible. It meant standing in the great hall, holding a heavy pitcher of spiced wine, trying to melt into the tapestries. King Kalen sat on the throne, a throne carved from the obsidian heart of a mountain. He was as cold and unyielding as the stone he sat upon. Centuries of rule had honed him into something terrifyingly still. His hair was the silver of winter frost, his eyes a pale, piercing gray that seemed to see everything and feel nothing. He never smiled, he rarely spoke, but when he did, his voice was the deep rumble of an avalanche, and everyone listened. Ilara kept her eyes downcast, focused on the worn stone at her feet. Nyx was nestled in his sling, unusually quiet. She prayed he would stay that way. The air in the hall was thick with the drone of lords and petitioners. Lord Valerius, the king's chief advisor, stood at the foot of the throne, his voice slick and polished as he delivered his reports. Valerius was a man who smiled often, but his smiles never reached his cold, calculating eyes. He was a firm believer in the old ways, in the culling of weakness. He was everything she feared. Then, a small wiggle against her ribs. Ilara's breath caught. Nyx was waking up. He squirmed, his tiny claws snagging on the fabric of her dress. Before she could soothe him, he wriggled free of the sling's opening and dropped to the floor with a soft thump. A collective gasp rippled through the silent court. Nyx, disoriented by the sudden fall and the cacophony of new sounds and scents, began to wander. He trotted forward on his clumsy puppy legs, his head held high, his ears swiveling. He was a tiny patch of midnight on the vast, pale expanse of the throne room floor, and he walked directly toward the obsidian throne. He bumped gently into the leg of the throne. Then, seeming to sense the presence of the man sitting upon it, he sniffed the air and took another step, bumping his head softly against the king's massive leather-clad boot. The silence in the hall was absolute. It was so profound, Ilara could hear the frantic, terrified drumming of her own heart. No one moved, no one breathed. Lord Valerius broke the spell. His voice was sharp, laced with disgust. "What is this filth? A defective cur in the royal court. Guards, remove it. Destroy it." The words were a physical blow. Destroy it. Panic, cold and sharp, sliced through her. Forgetting her place, forgetting her fear of being seen, she moved. She darted forward, her worn slippers silent on the stone, and knelt, scooping the small blind pup into her arms. She held him to her chest, turning her body to shield him from the guards who were now advancing. She looked up, her terrified gaze colliding with the pale, icy eyes of the Alpha King. He had not moved a muscle. He was watching her, his expression unreadable. She expected fury. She expected dismissal. She expected him to wave a hand and seal her fate and Nyx's with a single, cold gesture. Instead, a deep voice rumbled through the hall, stopping the guards in their tracks. "Stay." It was one word, not a shout, but a quiet command that held the weight of mountains. The guards froze. Valerius's lips thinned into a hard line. King Kaelin's gaze never left Alara. He looked at the trembling girl in the drab servant's dress, her arms wrapped around a flawed, blind pup as if it were the most precious treasure in the world. He saw the defiance in her eyes, a silent scream of protection that defied her mute lips. He saw the pup nuzzling into her neck, utterly trusting. For the first time in a century, the Alpha King felt something stir in the frozen sea of his chest, a flicker of something. Not warmth, not yet, but curiosity. A deep, unsettling resonance. He rose slowly from his throne. The court held its breath. He was a towering figure, his presence filling the hall, radiating a power that was ancient and absolute. He walked down the few steps and stopped before her. Alara trembled, pressing Nyx closer. She was so close she could smell the cold pine and winter air on him, see the faint silver streaks at his temples. He did not look at Valerius. He did not look at the court. His pale gray eyes were fixed on her. He crouched down, a startling move for a king, bringing himself to her level. He reached out a hand, not to her, but to the pup. His fingers, long and scarred, were surprisingly gentle as they brushed against Nyx's soft fur. The pup, instead of flinching, leaned into the touch. "He is blind," Kaelin stated, his voice a low murmur meant only for her. It was not a question. Alara could only nod, her throat tight with unshed tears. "And you are his eyes," the king continued, his gaze lifting from the pup to her face. He saw the stark terror there, but beneath it, a bedrock of strength that intrigued him. He saw the way she held the small creature, the fierce, unconditional love in her posture. He stood, turning to face his stunned advisor. "Lord Valerius," he said, his voice ringing with cold authority, "you see a defect. I see loyalty. The pup is under my protection." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the silent courtiers before landing back on Alara. "As is its keeper." He turned and walked back to his throne, the moment over as quickly as it had begun. "Continue with the reports," he commanded, his voice once again flat and emotionless. But everything had changed. Alara knelt on the cold stone floor, clutching a blind pup to her chest, the focus of every eye in the room. The most powerful man in the world, the cold and unfeeling Alpha King, had chosen her. He had seen her, and she had no idea why. The king's protection was a strange and disorienting thing. Alara was moved from her cramped alcove into a suite of rooms near the royal wing. They were small, but they were hers. There was a real bed with a thick fur blanket, a small fireplace that was always stocked with wood, and a window that looked out over the quiet, snow-dusted courtyard. It was more luxury than she had ever known, and it felt like a gilded cage. The official reason given was that the king wished to observe the unique bond between the mute servant and the blind pup. It was a scientific curiosity, the court whispered, a passing fancy of their ancient, inscrutable ruler. No one believed it was anything more. Alara didn't know what to believe. She was given a new title, Keeper of the Royal Kennels. It was a fiction, mostly. She spent her days with the wolves, as she always had, but now she was not just another servant. The other handlers gave her a wide berth, their gazes a mixture of fear and suspicion. She was the mute girl who had caught the king's eye. It marked her as something other, something dangerous. Kalen himself was a distant, imposing presence. She would see him in the corridors, his silver hair a stark contrast to his dark leather tunic, and he would incline his head in a barely perceptible nod. He never spoke to her in public. He maintained the cold, impenetrable facade of the Alpha King, but at night, things were different. The first time he came, she was sitting on the floor by the fire, teaching Nyx a new sound. A soft scratching of her nail on the stone hearth meant food. She was so focused, she didn't hear the door open. She only knew he was there when Nyx lifted his head, his ears perked, and let out a soft, welcoming whine. She scrambled to her feet, her heart hammering against her ribs. Kalen stood in the doorway, a massive silhouette against the dim light of the hall. He closed the door softly behind him, shutting out the rest of the world. He didn't speak. He simply walked to the armchair by the fire and sat down, motioning for her to continue. Trembling, she sank back to the floor. She tried to resume her lesson with Nyx, but her hands shook. The king's presence was overwhelming. He watched her, his pale eyes reflecting the firelight, his stillness a heavy weight in the small room. He came every night after that. It became a ritual. He would enter without a word and sit in the chair, and she would sit on the floor with Nyx. Sometimes she would groom the pup's coat. Sometimes she would continue her lessons of sound and touch. Sometimes they would simply sit in the shared silence, watching the flames dance in the hearth. It was a strange, fragile peace. In the quiet of her room, he was not the fearsome Alpha King. The harsh lines of his face seemed to soften in the firelight. The eternal coldness in his eyes would recede, replaced by a deep, aching loneliness she recognized because it mirrored her own. One night she found the courage to use the small slate and chalk he had left for her. She wrote, her letters clumsy from disuse. Why? She held it up for him to see. He looked at the slate, then at her. His gaze was intense, searching. He was silent for a long time, the only sound the crackle of the fire and Nyx's soft breathing. Finally he spoke, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the floor. My mate. My wife. She died. 400 years ago. He looked into the fire, his eyes seeing a past Alara could not imagine. Our pups, too. An illness that swept through the valley. I was away, fighting a war at the southern border. By the time I returned, he trailed off, the words unnecessary. The grief was a chasm in his voice. I have not felt anything since. Not anger, not joy. Nothing. The world became gray. He looked back at her, his expression raw, vulnerable in a way she never thought possible. Until that day in the hall, when you stood to protect him, he gestured to Nyx, asleep on her lap. I saw you, and I felt something, a flicker of color in the gray. I do not understand it, but I will not let it go. Her hand was shaking so hard she could barely write. I am broken, she wrote. I have no voice. Your silence is more honest than any words spoken in my court, he answered, his voice soft. You do not need a voice to have strength. After that night, the boundary between them began to dissolve. The space in the room seemed to shrink. His visits grew longer. He started bringing her things. A book of old legends, its pages filled with elegant script she could trace with her fingers. A small silver bell on a leather cord. For him, he'd said, nodding at Nyx. So he may always find you. She tied the bell to her wrist. The faint, clear chime became part of her. Nyx learned it instantly. Wherever she went, the bell was his beacon. He would trot confidently behind her, his blind eyes no hindrance, guided by the sound of her presence. One evening, Kalen arrived with a long, thin box. Inside was a flute, carved from pale, smooth willow wood. She looked at him, confused. She couldn't play. You hum for him, he said quietly. I thought, perhaps this would give your hum a voice. Tears pricked her eyes. No one had ever given her a gift that was so thoughtful, so personal. It wasn't a gift for a servant or for the mute girl. It was a gift for her, for the person he was beginning to see. Hesitantly, she took it. She put it to her lips, lips that had not formed a word in a decade. She blew gently. A low, soft note filled the room, pure and clear. It was shaky, uncertain, but it was a sound she had made. A piece of music. Nyx's ears twitched, and he rested his head on her knee, comforted. Kalen's expression was unreadable, but a muscle in his jaw tightened. He was seeing her, the resilient, kind woman who had survived the fire, and she was beginning to see him, the grieving, lonely man hidden inside the immortal king. She taught herself to play, simple melodies at first, sad, quiet tunes that spoke of the sorrow she could not. Kalen would sit and listen, his eyes closed. In those moments, the arrangement between them, the king and his curiosity, felt like a lie. This was something else entirely. Something fragile and terrifying and hopeful. Something that felt dangerously like home. But outside the warm, fire-lit bubble of her rooms, the world was growing colder. Lord Valerius watched the king's nightly visits with a hawk's eye. He saw the new cloak Elara wore, the way the guards now bowed to her. He saw the mute girl, the nobody, becoming somebody. A weakness in his king, a threat to his own influence, and his vision of a strong, ruthless pack. And he began to lay his trap. The whispers started subtly, like smoke curling under a door. A word here, a suggestion there. Strange, isn't it? The king, so taken with a mute. A broken thing. The whispers spread from the court to the kitchens, from the barracks to the kennels, and the blind pup. It's a bad omen, a sign of decay. Elara felt the shift in the air. The sideways glances were colder, the suspicion thicker. She kept to her rooms, finding solace only with Nyx and in the king's quiet evening company. She tried to ignore the fear that was a constant, icy knot in her stomach. Then a sickness swept through the lower kennels. 3 of the older wolves grew weak, their breath coming in ragged pants. The pack's healers were baffled. Lord Valerius saw his opportunity. He stood before the council, his face a mask of grave concern. "The omen has come to pass," he announced, his voice ringing with false piety. "The weakness we allowed into our midst has begun to fester. The blind cur and its silent keeper have brought a curse upon us." Kalen, seated on his throne, went rigid. His eyes, which had been softening in Elara's presence, turned to chips of ice. "You have proof of this accusation, Valerius?" His voice was dangerously low. "The proof is in our traditions, my king," Valerius said smoothly. "Our laws are clear. Nature purges its own flaws. By sheltering this imperfection, we have invited corruption. The girl is from the Whispering Woods. We all know the stories of the silent witches who lived there, who could steal the voice from a man's throat and the life from a wolf's heart." The council members murmured amongst themselves, their faces pale. The legends were old, but they still held power. "She is a servant girl who suffered a tragedy," Kalen countered, his voice like cracking ice. "Is she?" Valerius pressed, his eyes glittering. He produced a rolled-up parchment. "I had inquiries made. The fire that took her family. There were no other bodies found. Only her, wandering without a scratch, and without a voice. Is it not more likely she was a sacrifice to a dark power? Or worse, the cause of the fire itself? A witch's power manifesting for the first time?" The accusation hung in the air, vile and poisonous. Elara, who had been summoned to stand at the edge of the chamber, felt the blood drain from her face. He was twisting her trauma into a weapon. He was making her a monster. Kalen stood, his full, terrifying height silencing the room. "Enough." The word was a thunderclap. She is under my protection. This council is dismissed. He strode from the throne room without another glance, but the damage was done. The seed of fear had been planted. That night, he did not come to her room. Elara sat alone with Nyx, the silence pressing in on her, heavier than ever before. The little flute lay untouched on the table. The warmth they had built felt fragile, about to shatter. The next day, Kaelin made a public declaration. He walked into the main courtyard during the midday meal, with Elara at his side. He didn't touch her, but his proximity was a statement. Nyx trotted behind them, guided by the chime of the bell on her wrist. Elara is a guest of this keep, and will be treated with the respect due to one under the Alpha King's personal shield, he announced to the assembled pack. Any who speak against her will answer to me. His words were absolute, but they did not quell the fear. They inflamed it. To many, it looked as if their king was bewitched, choosing a broken, possibly cursed girl over the welfare of his pack. Valerius watched from the shadows, a faint, triumphant smile on his lips. Kaelin had played directly into his hands, isolating himself with his new pet. The threat was no longer just whispers. It was a palpable thing, a beast circling in the dark. Elara felt it in the way servants would drop what they were holding and flee when she entered a room. She saw it in the hard, hostile eyes of the guards. She and Nyx were the focus of all the pack's fear and superstition. A few nights later, Kaelin came to her room again. The space between them was fraught with tension. He looked weary, the weight of his crown and his choice heavy on his brow. He stood by the window, staring out at the snow. Valerius is invoking the old rites, he said, his voice flat. He is demanding a trial of purity. For the pup. Elara's blood ran cold. She knew of the old rites. They were barbaric rituals from a darker time, meant to purge weakness. They were trials by fire, by water, by combat. No pup could survive them. She grabbed her slate, her hands shaking violently. No. You are the king. Forbid it. He turned from the window, and the look on his face shattered her heart. It was a look of utter helplessness. I cannot. The law is ancient. If a ranking lord invokes it for the health of the pack, and the council supports him, my hands are tied. To deny it would be seen as tyranny. It would split the pack. There would be civil war. He was trapped. His own laws, his own traditions, were being used to destroy the one thing that had brought a flicker of light back into his world. He has cornered me, Elara, Kaelin whispered, the words ragged. He knows I will not let the pup be harmed. He thinks I will choose, that I will send you away to appease the council and save my throne. She looked at him, her eyes wide with terror. Was that what he was going to do? Was this goodbye? He crossed the room in 2 strides and took her by the shoulders. His grip was firm, desperate. I will not, he said, his voice a fierce, low growl. I will not lose you. It was the closest he had ever come to a confession. It was a raw, possessive declaration that left no room for doubt. But it didn't change the fact that they were caught in a trap. Valerius had set the board perfectly. The crisis was no longer a matter of if, but when, and it would be paid for in blood and fire. The day of the trial dawned gray and oppressive. A heavy sky pressed down on the keep, smothering sound, promising a storm. Elara had not slept. She had spent the night holding Nyx, stroking his soft fur, memorizing the feel of his small, warm body against hers. The bell on her wrist was silent. There was nowhere for him to follow her to safety. Kaelin was summoned to an emergency council meeting at dawn. A diversion. Elara knew it the moment the guards came for the pup. They were Valerius's men, their faces hard and devoid of pity. She stood in front of Nyx's basket, her body a flimsy, silent shield. She shook her head, pleading with her eyes. They simply pushed her aside. She stumbled and fell, her head hitting the stone floor. As they lifted the basket containing the whimpering pup, she could only watch, helpless. The world swam in a haze of gray. Panic gave her a strength she didn't know she possessed. She scrambled to her feet and ran. She flew down the cold stone corridors, her bare feet slapping against the flagstones, following the sounds of the guards' heavy boots and Nyx's faint, terrified cries. They were headed for the Great Hall, the heart of the keep, the place where she had first been seen by the king. She burst through the massive doors. The scene was worse than she had imagined. The hall was filled with the pack's elite, their faces grim and expectant. In the center of the room, the great ceremonial fire pit, usually cold, was roaring, spitting embers high into the air. And beside it stood Lord Valerius. He held Nyx aloft by the scruff of his neck. The pup dangled over the flames, kicking his small legs, his silent whines lost in the crackle of the fire. "Behold the source of our decay!" Valerius's voice boomed, filled with righteous fury. "The law is clear. The pack must be cleansed by fire. Today, we burn out this weakness and restore our strength." A roar of approval went up from some corners of the hall. Others watched in silence, their faces conflicted but unwilling to defy the ancient rite. Then Kaelin's voice cut through the noise, a roar of pure rage. "Valerius!" The king stood at the entrance to the hall, flanked by his personal guard. But more of Valerius's men stood between him and the fire pit, their spears crossed. He was blocked, trapped by the theater of law and tradition his advisor had so masterfully orchestrated. "My king," Valerius said, a triumphant sneer on his face, "you are welcome to witness the renewal of your pack. The law is being upheld. You cannot interfere." Kaelin's eyes glowed with a feral golden light. His power rolled off him in waves, a pressure that made the very air tremble. But he did not move. He was the king. The law was his to uphold, even when it was a dagger in his own heart. He could kill Valerius. He could kill them all. But the pack would fracture, and centuries of stability would turn to dust. He was paralyzed. The agony on his face was a physical thing. He was watching his world turn gray all over again. Elara saw it all. She saw the terrified pup she loved. She saw the triumphant, cruel face of the man who had orchestrated this. And she saw the king, the powerful, immortal Alpha, brought to his knees not by an army, but by his own laws. She saw his pain, and it was a mirror of her own. Everything went silent in her mind. The roar of the crowd, the crackle of the fire. It all faded away into a distant hum. A memory bloomed behind her eyes, hot and vivid. Another fire. Her home, burning. Her parents' screams. And her own scream, a sound of such agony and terror that it had ripped her voice from her throat and left only silence in its wake. For 10 years, fire had been her terror, the source of her brokenness. But as she looked at Nyx dangling over the flames, a new feeling rose up, hotter and more powerful than any fear. It was rage, a pure protective fury, a rage for this small, innocent life, a rage for the lonely king being forced to watch, a rage for the silent girl who had endured and survived. This fire would not take anything else from her. She took a step forward, then another. She walked toward the fire pit, her gaze locked on Valerius. He watched her approach, a contemptuous smile playing on his lips. What could the mute girl do? She opened her mouth, the place of ash and silence, the tomb of her voice. She drew a breath, not of air, but of will, of love, of fury. She gathered every bit of her pain, every silent plea, every ounce of her devotion to the pup and the king, and she forged it into a single word. Stop. The word was not a scream. It was not a shout. It was a physical force, a wave of sonic power that slammed through the hall. It was her voice, but it was more. It was clear, resonant, and imbued with an authority that was ancient and absolute. It was the voice of her ancestors, a long-forgotten line of spirit speakers whose command could calm the storm and silence the thunder. The effect was instantaneous and stunning. The roaring flames in the fire pit collapsed, shrinking down to glowing embers in an instant, as if a giant hand had snuffed them out. The spears of the guards clattered to the floor as the men holding them stumbled back, their hands clapped over their ringing ears. Lord Valerius froze solid, his arm outstretched, his face a mask of utter shock. Nyx, no longer in danger, swung gently in his grasp. The entire hall was plunged into a stunned, ringing silence. The only one who seemed unaffected by the sonic blast was Kalen. The spell of his paralysis was broken. His eyes, blazing gold, were fixed on her. He didn't look surprised. He looked as if he was seeing something he had been waiting for his entire life, without knowing it. He broke through the line of stunned guards as if they were made of paper. But he did not go for Valerius. He did not go for the pup. He came directly to her. He stopped in front of her, his massive frame shielding her from the shocked stares of the court. He reached up, his hand surprisingly gentle, and cupped her face. His thumbs traced the line of her lips, which were still tingling from the force of the words she had spoken. "Your voice," he breathed, his own voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. It was awe. It was reverence. Tears streamed down her face, washing away a decade of silence. She looked up into his golden eyes, and for the first time, she spoke a name. Kalen. Her voice was soft, a little rusty, but it was hers, and the sound of his name on her lips seemed to settle something deep within him, calming the storm that had raged in him for centuries. It was the anchor he never knew he was missing. He closed his eyes for a moment, savoring the sound. Then he opened them, and the gentle awe was replaced by the cold, absolute fury of the Alpha King. He turned slowly, his gaze falling upon the still frozen Lord Valerius. "You invoked the old rites to test for weakness, my lord," Kalen said, his voice dangerously calm. "And weakness has been revealed." He strode forward and plucked Nyx from Valerius's limp grasp as easily as taking a toy from a child. He cradled the pup for a moment before turning and placing him gently back into Ilara's waiting arms. Nyx immediately began licking her face, his tail wagging furiously. Kalen turned back to his advisor, who was finally beginning to shake off the effects of her command. "You sought to divide my pack with fear. You used our sacred laws to threaten an innocent. You mistook kindness for weakness. You are the corruption we needed to purge." He didn't need to raise his voice. Every wolf in the hall saw the truth. They had witnessed her power, a power used not for destruction, but for protection. They had seen Valerius's treachery for what it was. The tide of their loyalty turned in an instant, rushing back to their king. "Guards!" Kalen commanded. "Take him to the dungeons. He will await my judgment." Valerius's men, their loyalty to him shattered, were the first to obey, seizing their former master and dragging him away, his face pale with defeat and disbelief. The hall was quiet now, the tension broken. Kalen dismissed the council and the court with a wave of his hand. They fled, eager to escape the charged atmosphere, leaving the three of them alone in the vast empty space. Kalen came back to her. He stood before her, not as a king, but as a man who had been willing to lose his throne for her. "I have not felt true fear since I lost my family," he said, his voice low and raw. "I felt it today. The fear of losing you, of my world returning to gray." She looked down at the pup in her arms, then back up at him. "You stayed," she whispered, her new voice still a marvel to her. "You didn't send us away." "I would sooner have let the mountains fall into the sea," he said with fierce intensity. He reached out and brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "That power, your voice, it is magnificent. but it is not why I chose you. I chose you when you were silent, he continued, his eyes searching hers. I chose you when you were a servant girl with nothing but a fierce heart. I chose you because you walked into my cold, dead world and taught a blind pup how to see. You taught me how to see. He leaned down and pressed his forehead against hers. I love you, Alara. I think I have from the moment you defied my entire court for the sake of the smallest, most broken creature among us. The words she had longed to hear, words she never thought possible, washed over her. Her own feelings, locked away in silence for so long, finally had a way out. I love you, Kaelin, she whispered, and the words were the truest sound she had ever made. He finally kissed her then. It wasn't a king claiming his prize. It was a drowning man breathing air for the first time. It was a kiss of desperation and relief, of centuries of loneliness finally ending. In the heart of the great hall, surrounded by the embers of a dead fire, their new world began. 6 months later, the Great Keep was a different place. The chill of fear and suspicion had been replaced by a quiet, steady warmth that seemed to emanate from the new Alpha Queen herself. Alara wore the title with a grace that surprised everyone but her king. She was not a queen of grand pronouncements and lavish displays. She was a queen of quiet strength, of gentle hands, and of a voice that, when used, held the power of the earth itself. She rarely used the commanding force of her ancestral gift. She had discovered it could soothe the agitated, mend-bruised spirits and bring a sense of profound peace to those who listened. Her favorite use of it, however, was in the quiet moments. She would hum the melodies she once played on her flute, and the sound would carry through the halls, a gentle reminder that their queen was watching over them. Lord Valerius was gone, exiled to the barren lands beyond the northern peaks, stripped of his title and his power. His brand of strength, born of cruelty and fear, had no place in the new world Kaelin and Alara were building. Nyx was now a lanky young wolf, his coat a glossy black, his blind eyes no longer a mark of tragedy, but a symbol of the pack's new creed. That true strength lay in protecting the vulnerable, not culling them. He navigated the keep's corridors with an uncanny confidence, his head cocked, always listening for the faint silver chime of the bell on Alara's wrist. He was never far from her side, a loyal, living shadow. Kaelin was transformed. The icy stillness was gone, replaced by a deep, rumbling vitality. He smiled now, a true, breathtaking smile that reached his golden eyes. He laughed, a sound so rare and wondrous the first time she heard it that Alara had stopped dead in the middle of the courtyard just to listen. The ghosts of his past were not vanquished, but they were quiet, soothed by the presence of his new family. He was no longer just a king ruling over a pack. He was a mate, a husband, and a devoted guardian to a mischievous blind wolf. One evening, they sat together by the fire in their chambers, the same room where he had first come to sit with her in silence. The air was no longer heavy with unspoken things, but filled with a comfortable, easy quiet. Nyx was curled on the hearth, his head resting on Kaelin's boot, twitching in a dream of chasing rabbits he'd only ever known by scent and sound. Alara leaned her head against Kaelin's shoulder, tracing the patterns on the sleeve of his tunic. I was so afraid that day, she said softly, her voice still a quiet miracle to them both. In the hall. I thought I would lose him. I thought I would lose you. Kaelin wrapped his arm around her, pulling her closer. You were never going to lose me, he murmured into her hair. But you were never meant to be a victim of that fire, Alara. Not the one that took your family, or the one Valerius lit for you. Fire doesn't destroy you. It reveals you. It burns away what you are not, and shows what you have always been. He tilted her chin up, his gaze soft and full of love. You are the fire, my queen, the warmth this kingdom has needed for centuries. She smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the hearth. She was no longer the mute girl, the broken thing. She was Alara, the Alpha Queen. She was a survivor. She was a protector. She was loved. She looked at the sleeping wolf at their feet, a perfect creature born of imperfection. She looked at the ancient, powerful king who had found his heart in a silent servant's courage. She had a voice. She had a home. She had a pack. The cold had finally, truly, left her bones. Here, in the arms of her king, with her blind wolf safe at her feet, she was finally, incandescently warm.